I think it'd be safe to say that many of us have negative connotations associated with loneliness. It implies that we are somehow in deficit mode, that we're incomplete or less than, lacking, outside of, socially inept, not belonging. We don't see it the way the writer Natalie Goldberg does, a partially feral dog that we like to keep around to remind us to stay awake and not become complacent. Loneliness taunts, haunts, and torments. One should not, however, equate loneliness with being alone. For being alone does not mean that one feels unrest or disease, longing, less than, incomplete. Being alone can be painful. It can be solace. It is an internal reckoning. Loneliness is a state of heart and mind. It is, as May Sarton wrote, a poverty of the self. Likewise, we should not equate solitude with loneliness, for solitude is populated, as May Sarton says, with the richness of the self. Devotees of many religious traditions often seek solitude. They don't necessarily seek the richness of the self that Sarton describes, but in fact to shed that self, to let the illusions of the world fall away. They take themselves to solitude to be freed from possible distraction, hoping for the possibility of revelation, or a folding into whatever is at the core of all being. The writer Patrick Susskind describes them as such. We are familiar with people who seek out solitude, penitents, failures, saints, prophets. They retreat to deserts, preferably where they live on locusts and honey. Others, however, live in caves or cells on remote islands. Some, more spectacularly, squat in cages mounted atop high poles swaying in the breeze. They do this to be nearer to God. Their solitude is a self-mortification by which they do penance. They act in the belief that they are living a life pleasing to God, or they wait months, years, for their solitude to be broken by some divine message that they hope then can be speedily broadcast amongst all of humankind. Now, I don't think this is a form of solitude that UUs typically seek out or are comfortable with. It's kind of been updated somewhat. One rarely sees these pillar saints in the deserts anymore. Yet there are those who we often call holy, who are seeking out the Holy of Holies in sheltered spaces removed from everyday life. At the same time, there are those who enter solitude to find connection with all of life. Solitude is pure potential. It can be the place where one separates the wheat from the chaff of the self. It can be a place of reckoning. It can be as easily fraught as it can be a place of utter contentment and peace. Even as many of us long to belong, there are those of us who long for solitude and to find within it anything but loneliness. We find that we belong to something else that is larger than we could have ever imagined. We may be seeking the richness of the self, or to reclaim the self from the vagaries of ordinary life. We may come already knowing a place of comfort within solitude, or come desperate for comfort. Wendell Berry writes, "True solitude is found in wild places, where one is without human obligation. One's inner voice becomes audible." Yet these wild places of which Wendell Berry speaks are disappearing all around us. And with their disappearance also comes the disappearance of silence. and the opportunity for solitude. For it is the wild places that are the last places on earth that hold the sound of silence. In an article that appeared in the November-December 2008 issue of Orion magazine, Kathleen Dean Moore, philosopher, writer, and environmental activist who lives up in the Corvallis area, wrote about her experience with Gordon Hempton, who was, quote, on a mission to record the natural sounds of the world before they are drowned out by human noise. He called his project 1 Square Inch of Silence, in which he was searching for, quote, 1 square inch where he could listen for 15 minutes and not hear a human sound, but only the whisper of his pencil on wet paper. And you know where he found that sound? In the Olympic Peninsula. Kathleen Dean Moore goes on to write, it's not easy to find silence in the modern world. If a quiet place is one where you can listen for 15 minutes in daylight hours without hearing a human-created sound, there are no quiet places left in Europe. There are none east of the Mississippi River. And in the American West, maybe 12. Remember, this was 2008. So I've come to believe that there are 2 types of silences or solitude. One is the silence that Gordon Hempton describes. Silence is like scouring sand, he says. When you are quiet, the silence blows against your mind and etches away everything that is soft and unimportant. That is the silence that is full of sound, of the chatter of our minds and the restlessness of our bodies, the yearning of our lives and hearts, the dark night of the soul that the mystics talk about. These silences can be a bit torturous, for there are big sounds within that silence. That silence is but one way in which we reach the truth of our inner landscape. Yet there is another kind of silence. Kathleen Dean Moore puts it this way: silence creates an opening, an absence of self, which allows the larger world to enter into our awareness. It brings us into contact with what is beyond us, its beauty and mystery. Silence is not the absence of sounds, but a way of living in the world, an intentional awareness, an expression of gratitude, to make of one's own ears, one's own body, a sounding board that resonates in its hollow places with the vibrations of the world. Similarly, solitude is not necessarily being alone or lonely. It can open and connect us to all that is. In her book, The Solitude of Open Spaces, Greta Ehrlich writes, in nature there is unrelenting beauty, life pushing always toward life. And right alongside of that force is also death, the companion. They circle round each other within the cycle of nature. For Ehrlich and Barry, solitude is not running away from the world or life, but entry into the fullness and cycle of it. Solitude is not an escape or a retreat, but rather revelatory. I can remember one of the first times that solitude and silence made its impact on me. I was not alone, but I was in a place of solitude, on state or Forest Service or BLM lands somewhere in the northwest corner of Nevada. 4 of us had wandered off-road, following our noses toward more and more space and quiet and solitude. After making our way up a very steep, narrow dirt road, we arrived at a flat spot and we set up camp. And after that, we went for a hike and hiked up further still to a place where there were these large, smooth boulders that we climbed up upon and looked out and gazed out over probably 30 miles into the distance. Below us stretched an open, seemingly uninhabited land. The mountains rose up, the wind brought its song. In the company of friends, I entered solitude and found myself calmed by the sheer immensity of that wild and open space. It wasn't a matter of being put in my place, like that slide I showed you a few weeks ago, you know, the one with the whole cosmos and the arrow pointing and saying, "You are here." It was a matter of being put into that space, into that landscape of inhabiting solitude. Twice I have intentionally sought solitude for a month at a time, both during sabbaticals. The first one took place in a Catholic community south of Big Sur. It sits about 1,500 feet straight up off the highway with a view of the ocean. I was given a mouse-infested trailer for my month. That was to be my home. And like so many of us do, when we choose solitude or a retreat, we have this agenda. We go into it thinking, I'm going to work on this. I got this thing to explore, get to the bottom of. And that first time I thought I was choosing grief. But grief was not choosing me. I was to explore silence and the utter quieting of my mind and heart. I found an inner stillness I did not know I possessed. When it came time for me to leave, I would have, if I could have, turned right around and given myself over to another month. That solitude, that silence had held so much. And they were, as May Sarton says, rich. My second sabbatical exploration of solitude was entirely different. I've done the Catholic thing. I thought I'd like to choose another religious option. And so I chose a Buddhist retreat center. When I arrived, I realized that I had no need to keep silence, though I would move in and out of solitude in my time there. I had my own cabin where I kept a sort of daily accounting of what I was thinking or learning or observing. I walked a lot. I read. I lay on the bed and gazed unseeing into the sunlight that filtered in through my window and dozed and rested. I sat with members of the Sangha every morning, rising in the winter dark to a sky strewn with stars. I hung out with the Zen priest, doing everything from learning the ins and outs of meditation to watching the Super Bowl and sharing meals together. But he wouldn't let me idolize him and hang on his every word. In fact, one day he yelled at me as I was scrambling to take notes during our conversation. He said, "Stop that." None of that mattered. What mattered was the discipline, the practice of sitting, entering silence, of keeping times of solitude. I know that lots of people describe solitude to a mirror being held up to the self, where the truth is revealed. But I've come to think of it as more of an ocean of unexplored depth, allowing the opportunity to go ever deeper into both awareness and mystery. Sometimes that ocean, that sea, is as still as glass. And other times, it is raging, it is swelling, it is crashing, it is turbulent. Sometimes we need to take an issue, a question into solitude with the end of discernment or clarity. As sometimes we enter it without expectation, giving ourselves to it, taking from it what we will. But it is rare to experience solitude without being changed by it, for it shapes and reshapes those who come to it. Some of you may have read that novel that's been out for, I don't know, maybe a year. It's Delia Owens' book, Beyond Where the Crawdads Sing. The reader is exposed to a terrifying and devastating portrayal of loneliness that comes in the aftermath of betrayal and abandonment. But that loneliness shifts to become an aloneness, then shifts again to become a settled solitude. Each becomes a state of being, the norm for the main character. A solitude that is fermented with sporadic and unpredictable interactions with other human beings. And it is a solitude that will be destroyed. It is a story that is once brutal and beautiful. I found myself easily entering the fictional world where the protagonist grows up in isolated natural abundance, living by the cycles of the seasons and from what the land and the sea had to offer. Hers was a tale of survival, necessitated by being left alone. But it was the solitude she inhabited that ironically created her survival. In 2005, the documentary Into Great Silence was released. The filmmaker, Philip Browning, had waited 16 years for the Carthusian monks who live in the French Alps to grant him permission to film their community life. He spent 6 months living with and filming the monks. He prefers to call the film a meditation rather than a documentary. And for those of us who are used to a screen filled with the visual assault of action, action, action in 76 minutes, this film will be excruciating. You know, I myself am counting the days until Terminator 3 is being released. I don't care if it's gotten bad reviews. But in Groening's film, there's no soundtrack, there's no narration, and there's no plot. Only the committal to film of the weekly rhythm of the monks' lives of silence. They are an order that was founded by Saint Bruno in 1084, an order that has taken a vow of contemplation and poverty. The early monks actually copied those beautiful manuscripts as well as meditated. And I found a page on a Franciscan website that describes both Saint Bruno and his order. This saint has the honor of having founded a religious order which, as the saying goes, has never had to be reformed because it was never deformed. No doubt, both the founder and the members would reject such high praise, but it is an indication of the saint's intense love of a penitential life in solitude. Now, those monks do break silence once a week when they go for their Monday communal walk, and they do Gregorian chant in their worship. But otherwise, the film exposes the viewer to a group of men who have chosen a life in silence in order to hear the larger, greater silence for them of God, maybe for the rest of us of mystery. Theirs is a life of solitude I'm not sure many of us could bear. But like the monks atop the hill in Big Sur, it may just be their prayers, their silence, that is holding up the world. The poet and short story writer Elizabeth Bishop wrote that everyone should experience at least one prolonged period of solitude in life, which is fine for those who are independently wealthy, as she was. But rather than dismiss her statement for its classism and privilege, I would like to echo it. Though we may not be able to take prolonged periods away from our responsibilities or be so lucky as to have paid sabbaticals, it is possible for any of us to experience, however briefly, moments or periods of solitude. A solitude that can bring out creativity, a solitude that can aid with discernment, a solitude that can restore and renew. These solitudes can be stolen, grabbed, created in bits and pieces and in snippets. Solitude moments. For who gets to determine the length of solitude? My sister used to write my siblings and I to keep us abreast of the goings-on and the antics of her young children as they lived out in the country outside of Portland. In one such letter, my sister recounted the story of my then young nephew, James. When my sister had reached the limits of her toleration for certain of his behaviors, she would tell him to go to his room and not come out until he could be nice. One time, he went into his room, simultaneously shouting, "I can be nice," and slamming the door. At some point later, I presume he emerged, probably to be nice. Now, I have no idea what happened during his time out, his isolation, his time alone, his solitude, but I'm convinced that it gave him time to sort through whatever it was he was upset about, or to be distracted and his attention redirected to a toy or something else in his room, or perhaps he ripped his room apart, and when his fury was spent, was able to return to his nice self. I have come to like this notion of timeouts for all ages. I remember walking into my neighbor's home in Bozeman. She was sitting quietly and alone without her young children, and I looked at her inquisitively, and she just looked up and she said, "I gave myself a timeout." But I want you to remember what my sister, who just happens to be here today, by the way, I want you to remember what she said to my nephew before he went into his room. She didn't call it a timeout. She didn't frame it as a punishment. She didn't tell him how long he had to stay in his room or set a timer. She put all the responsibility on my nephew. He was to stay in his room until he could be nice. That time alone was his, to find himself again, to return to that nicer self again. Maybe it wasn't the solitude like the monks in the French Alps keep, but it was that aloneness with the self that allowed his transformation or his return. Solitude isn't punishment. It's possibility. Timeouts can teach us that to be alone is not necessarily to be lonely. So here's the thing. Solitude isn't all ecstasy and revelation and comfortable. For some of us, keeping our own company is terrifying. We come up against the truth of our lives if we allow ourselves to let solitude do its work. Solitude allows us to wake up, to become aware, and it might require something of us, if nothing else, to emerge from it with the commitment to live the truth that we've stumbled upon. And it may incite change, and hello, change isn't always pleasant. But solitude beckons and calls as a gift to any one of us who is willing to listen. And believe it or not, those who experience solitude often grow to crave it. It has nothing to do with being an introvert or extrovert. It has to do with the soul's longing. One last thing about solitude. Most of us return from it. Buddha spent years in solitude seeking enlightenment, and when he achieved it, what did he do? He returned to the marketplace of human life in order to offer his teachings. Likewise, Jesus took himself apart from his disciples time and time again, initially for a kind of purification, and then for prayer and discernment. Yet he too always returned to those he wished to serve. I know that we are not all Buddhas or all Christs, but we too can return from solitude, bearing its gifts. As Wendell Berry writes, from the order of nature, we return to the order and disorder of humanity. From the larger circle, we must go back to the smaller within the larger and dependent on it. We're not all built to be those monks in the French Alps. But I would invite you all to enter whatever solitude it is that you can avail yourselves of or find or create. To let it bring you through whatever it is that you fear or that weights your being. To let it hold your sorrow, your grief, your uncertainty, your pain, your suffering, to let all of that come into raptor-like vision and clarity. Likewise, it also holds the joys of the heart and of our being. But to experience solitude and to know that we can each be transformed by it. I'm very aware that we are about to enter into an intense season of endless gift-giving, commotion, consumption, party, 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 gathering, 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 obligation, obligation, obligation. And so my hope for you this season, that somewhere amidst the distractions, the commotion, the responsibility, the obligations, the parties, the consumption, that you will find a way to let solitude be a gift that you receive this season. May it be so.